Hi, everybody. This is fine? Okay, good. So I am, again, like everybody else, very thankful for Brian and Marianne and Tina for inviting me to take part in this stimulating conference. I'm especially excited to be here to chair the wonderful panel entitled Performance and Transformation, Photographic Revisions of Subjectivity. So I want to open by saying a few things about photography and performativity. The transformative potentiality of photography, that is to say, the ability to go beyond the documentation and mere replication of the status quo, has long been discussed by theorists of photography in terms of performance and performativity. Bringing new and alternative aesthetic arrangements into the field of vision, photography has been said to have the potential to expand what Jacques Rancière has called the distribution of the sensible. Roland Barthes has highlighted the performative aspect of photography, stating that, I quote, "What founds the nature of photography is the pose." Barthes, like many others following him, has associated the performative nature of photography with the subject posing for the camera and with the photographic event taking place in the past and before the camera's lens. Others have directed attention to the performativity of photography by emphasizing the role of the spectator and the gaze. Susan Sontag, for example, has suggested that, I quote, "aesthetic distance seems built into the very experience of looking at photography." If this is indeed the case, then it is the difference or the gap or the distance between the image captured in the photograph and the aestheticization rendered by the spectators that is responsible for the performative affect of photography. Taking yet a different direction, Margaret Iversen has suggested that the performativity of photography is found in the fact that, I quote, "Photographs are less representations of objects than the effect of an event, not simply a pointing at the event an event in the world, but a subjective tracing of an event containing an odd displacement of the self." And finally, Ariella Azoulay has moved the attention away from image as appearance and event captured in the past or an aesthetic manifestation to suggest that photography should be read as a speech act, calling attention to the intersubjective relationship formed between the photographed and the viewer. Azoulay considers the performativity of the photograph to be carried in the form of an appeal, not in an image itself as a sealed object, but in the construction of the photograph as an event that takes place in the eyes of the willing and patient spectator, one who learned how to look and read rather than see the photograph. Different and varied as these theorizations are, they share a belief that it is the performativity of photography, whether it is found in the image as constructed or in the unpacking of the image by the spectator, that grounds photography its important political role as a transformative apparatus. The panel that you're about to hear addresses the questions of photography's relationship to performance and its ability to function as in transformative ways on the level of selfhood and subjectivity. How may photographs manipulate or invent conditions of the photographic portraiture to explore alternative, marginal, or less commonly visible perception, say of gender, sexuality, race, class, or ethnicity? Many important photographers have also made this question the center of their artistic practice. And I do want everybody to note that I am collapsing in the talk the art and the vernacular. And many of these artists are women who have used the medium to interrogate and challenge conventions of selfhood, whether gendered, sexualized, or radicalized. And it's, of course, an opportunity for me to share. I won't speak long about this, but just share some of the images that are familiar to many. So, for example, the various projects of self-portrait, which, of course, stage self-portrait as its own investigation of self and of photography itself. Sidney Sherman in the previous image, Kathy Opie in this one, Nan Goldin, and of course Laura Aguilar, whose recent death is devastating loss for us all. While the self-portrait as a frame through which to investigate photography and selfhood is what I've presented here, other forms of artistic photography also include various photographic interventions and what could be called explicitly personal sites. So I'm thinking, for example, of Joe Spence's Beyond the Family album, of Laura Simpson's The Photo Booth project, and I admit to be my favorite photographic series in the world, probably, Kitchen Table by Carrie Mae Wims. But questions of identity, self-representation, performance, transgression are not even mainly, the subject of artistic photography. These are questions that run through the history of photography as such. And while, as most personal photographs are created within what Marianne Hirsch has called, I quote, screen made of dominant mythologies and conceptions, such photographs also, and often, include within them both a critical investigation of the self and a direct or less so investigation of photography, its possibilities, limits, potentiality. Still, the transformative potentiality of photography is associated, in all of the examples I mentioned so far, with a clear demonstration, even highlighting, of the performativity of photography, the staging of the self in the self-portrait, or the invasion of alteration of personal spaces in the other photo projects. One remains curious, then, about the role of performativity in so-called personal photographs, the less overtly staged photograph, where the reflective gesture, the citationality, the parodic, or the accentuated staging is a lot harder to pinpoint. How much weight does performativity have then in those photographs, whether we call them vernacular photographs, everyday photographs, personal photographs? I pose this question as a way of opening a discussion. For me, it remains a question, one which I would like to ask as follows. How much does the transformative performativity of photography have to do with artistic production, public display, deliberate citationality of the image? So for my part, I want to probe this question by introducing very few images. In wisdom, I would like to focus on this question a little bit closer. I begin with a familiar photo. I presume many of you know it. Okay, so this is Opie's well-known image, Oliver in a tutu. It's from 2004. It is part of the series of In and Around the Home. The photo features the artist's son standing on a chair in a kitchen wearing a tiara and a tutu. For the most part, critics have read the work as breaking gender conventions, calling attention to the constructed nature of gender. In my mind, the work is primarily a visualization of the wide-range misogynist and homophobic paranoia about what happens to boys who are raised by lesbians. Of course, they become girls, or worse, boys in tutus. In any event, this photograph is both a personal photograph in the sense that it is a photo of the artist's child at home, part of the Everyday series, and also a public image, officially circulates as a work of art. The work invites spectators to privilege that performative and read the image as transgressive. And my question is of course, is it the image that is doing that, or is it the status of the work? So I move to my second image, and I want to ask if the same reading of performativity is advanced here and to the same degree, if at all. Less familiar, Omri in Atuga. This is a personal photo. In fact, the first time it is circulating outside of my family's virtual album. This is my son. How should we read Omri in Atuga? Are we compelled to read Omri in Atuga as Oliver in a tutu? Does the fact that Omri in Atuga is a personal photo claiming no artistic merits and no public statue make a difference in our reading of the photo? Is our reading of it as a performance? Is our reading of it as transformative? I leave the questions open as I move to my final image, another personal image, and indeed a very personal image. A photograph of myself at age 5. I admit that it is both tantalizing and embarrassing to me to share this photo. And not because of anything that you could or would see in it. It is rather a banal image of a young child half happy. I'm tantalized and embarrassed because of what I see in it, because of what I will always see in it, and probably only I will see in it. This simple black and white photograph truly has nothing remarkable about it, except for the fact that it holds and preserves a very important personal memory. The personal memory captured in this personal photograph can only be shared in relation to the image. It depends on my willingness to share my story with you and explain how after 4 decades that this photograph has been taken, I still have the bodily memory of touching that metal light pole as I'm looking direct at the camera. My mother is taking the photo. She's taking a photo of her child, but I know that this photographic event is significantly more important than anything she could imagine. The photograph remains for me a victory. Earlier in the day, I finally got a haircut. For almost a year, I have been begging my mother to cut my hair, something she refused. You simply do not cut such beautiful hair. I heard that over and over again. We argued also about clothes, my mother insisting that I will wear appropriate clothes, while I really wanted to fight for my right to dress like my hero, Mr. Rogers. Still is. That's what I'm going to be this Halloween. That day, however, I turned 5 and my mother could not resist my birthday wish. I want to get a haircut. She finally surrenders. The photo you see is taken shortly after. I am elated, but I also know I have to hide my joy, for after all, my mom is not particularly pleased. This is my first photo with short hair, well, short as my mother allowed. I'm staring at the camera, and I remember thinking how important this documentation was. For I knew this photograph was really capturing an ontological transition. When I look at this photo after it develops, I will see my miraculous transition from girl to boy. I had full trust in the materiality of the photograph and its capacity to turn my inner psychic fantasy into a corporeal reality. Everything depended on it. Where does this personal narrative about this personal photograph fit into discussions about performativity, the performativity of photographic pictures and its transformative potential? After all, if you look at the image, it is not the kind of image imagined when talking about photography's performativity. I raise this question because I want to encourage us to ask as we proceed, what is it that we actually talk about when we talk about the performativity of photography? And do we privilege certain photographic expressions over others? Do we privilege certain modes of performativity, certain understanding of visibility, the kind that allows an easy transition between the personal and the public? How much space, then, can we actually give to the personal when we analyze personal photographs? I leave you with these questions as I welcome our magnificent group of speakers who never sent me their papers, so I couldn't really say what they're talking about, but I'm sure it will be very interesting. Our first speaker, Shawn Michelle Smith. Thank you.
So I want to add my thanks to Tina and Mariana and Brian and Sarah for organizing this wonderful event and for inviting me to participate. I'm very happy to be in this company today. So I'm starting with an image that you have seen before. It's the image that Brian started us out with yesterday evening. And I want to ask you to linger with it just a little bit longer. An occupational portrait. A thin white man stands in the studio. He's dressed in a white shirt, dark vest and pants, and shoes that are showing signs of wear. He rests a bent arm on top of an enormous view camera that's supported by a tripod on wheels. Another stand, just behind him and visible at his feet, supports the man. He looks in the direction the camera points, as if both are focused on the same subject, off frame. The portrait is carefully composed. Light glints off the man's dark eyes and traces a pronounced profile. Lit from the side, he stands out in sharp relief against the dark background made by the receding space of an adjoining room. In his left hand, the man holds a shutter release connected to the camera by a long cable. Apparently, the cable has moved slightly, and its blur marks the long exposure. In his right hand, he holds a small bell, which rests on top of the camera. Is the bell a device to direct the look of a portrait subject toward the lens? Or is it used to call an assistant to collect the exposed plate from the camera? Or is it an invitation to later viewers to listen, in Tina Camp's words, to the sound of the photograph? This tintype brings photography into view in several ways. Notably, it makes its subject a photographer. It shows the labor one rarely sees in photographs, the work of the camera operator. The tintype makes visible that which is generally relegated to the unseen spaces off frame, behind the camera, or in the darkroom. Here is that other figure that animates the studio, that literally makes an image come into view, but remains out of sight. The materiality of the image is also prominently on display. The wet collodion has not been applied properly to the plate, or the emulsion has peeled back from the edges. All along the top and right borders of the plate, the milky traces of some mistake are visible. That mistake calls attention to the chemistry and material composition of the tintype. It highlights the surface of the plate rather than the image's visual, virtual depth. It refuses to allow one to imagine that she is seeing through the photograph and compels her to see photography itself. The tintype doubles the scene of photography. There's another photographer at work here. At first, I imagined that this image was taken by the photographer on view, that the photograph captured the event of its own making. I supposed that the photographer was photographing himself in a mirror, but the angles don't quite align. Instead, the image duplicates the performance, showing one act of photography while another remains unseen. Here is another occupational portrait. It too shows one act of photography while others remain out of sight. Here, a long legacy of conflicted photographic practice exerts a powerful signifying force on the image. This image shows an African-American man standing in a photographer's studio, posing in front of an elaborate painted backdrop. He's dressed in a white short-sleeved shirt, dark dress pants, and shiny dark shoes. He faces the camera squarely. His look is direct, his expression calm, perhaps just edging toward a smile. He is bound from neck to ankles in chains. This photograph, made in 1924 by James Van Der Zee, is entitled Escape Artist. It was produced during the height of Van Der Zee's portrait practice in Harlem and bears a number of the photographer's hallmarks, including the painted backdrop, beautiful lighting, and Van der Zee's name inscribed on the negative and rendered in white text in the print. But this portrait also puts photography under pressure, evoking a fluctuating dynamic of constraint and escape that animates a long history of African American photographic representation. Escape Artist is likely the portrait of a performer and intended to serve as a publicity image. It resembles a photograph of the most famous American escape artist, Harry Houdini, made in 1899, which presents him similarly bound in chains and padlocks. But in an African American cultural context, escape activates another register, the historical legacy of slavery and fugitivity, recalling not only Houdini, but also the men and women who escaped from slavery. Among the most famous fugitive slaves, Henry Brown shipped himself from Virginia to Pennsylvania in a wooden crate in 1849, and then rehearsed his escape for Northern audiences. His performances emphasized his conditional and fleeting liberty, underscoring, as Daphne Brooks has argued, quote, the ambiguities of liberty and bondage for African Americans in the wake of the 1850 fugitive slave law. Escape Artist presents a portrait of a Black man shackled and bound, and it resounds not only with the history of slavery, but also with the history of lynching and incarceration in the United States. If the man's chains evoke slavery, they also recall the chain gang, marking a legacy of surveillance and violence meted out on the Black body, a legacy passed on from slavery to the carceral state by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except in cases of criminal conviction and imprisonment. As a formal portrait made in Van der Zee's studio, Escape Artist also invites one to consider the legacy of photographic representation by which Van der Zee's subject is bound or enframed, in the words of Maurice Wallace. The photograph calls forth the complexities of Black representational space, reminding one of what Darby English has called, quote, the historical contents of certain contemporary constraints on artistic freedom for African Americans, end quote. These historical contents constitute a vast shadow archive. They include 19th century scientific photographs of the enslaved, such as the daguerreotypes made by Joseph Zeely for the polygenesis Louis Agassiz, as discussed by Brian Wallace and Suzanne Schneider. They include the photographs of Black wet nurses and servants with their white charges presented as property, props, and supports in the reproduction of whiteness, as illuminated by Laura Wexler. They include the horrors of Black men and women bound and hanging from trees in the photographs of lynching used to commemorate and spread white terror. But even as photography was a technology of violent racialization, the photographer's studio was also a place in which racist forces could be challenged, in which photography could be used to express African American resistance. As Bell Hooks has said of African American photography during the era of Jim Crow segregation, quote, the camera was the central instrument by which Blacks could disprove representations of us created by white folks, end quote. More recently, Leigh Raiford has argued, quote, the significance of photography as a liberatory tool of Black self-representation cannot be overstated, end quote. And Deborah Willis's groundbreaking and continuing work bears this out. Van der Zee's studio was a place in which African Americans could represent aspirations and dreams, staking a claim to a futurity that might be precarious outside the studio. But this figuration of desires and dreams might also be put under another kind of surveillance. Escape Artist recalls not only the pressures of racist representation, but also the demands for positive images. In 1926, W.B. Du Bois famously proclaimed that all art is propaganda, and he demanded from African American artists positive images to counter that of, quote, the Negro painted by white Americans, end quote. Van der Zee's portraits from the 1920s and 1930s are shining examples of the performance of African American ambition and futurity. But such portrait practices, although essential, also produce their own constraints, bolstering the burdens and disciplines of propriety, striving, and uplift. As Kevin Gaines and others have demonstrated, positive images of African American progress were also circumscribed along the lines of gender propriety in the early 20th century. Indeed, the middle class was defined in part by its adherence to normative codes of gender. According to Michelle Mitchell, social transformers depicted, quote, patriarchy and moral motherhood as transformative, regenerative forces, and both women and men reified motherhood as the primary catalyst for Black progress, end quote. In his studio, van der Zee often arranged objects to simulate elegant domestic spaces, posing families and couples to produce a visual register of an aspiring community coded in terms of class and gender. African American thinkers and practitioners of photography understood the medium's double promise and bind from the early years of the medium. And in light of the presentations last night and this morning that called slavery so powerfully into view, and even in the very definition of the vernacular, I think it's important to consider how photography was used by the formerly enslaved. So I want to turn briefly to Frederick Douglass. In the 1860s, Frederick Douglass, one of the first theorists of photography, declared that the technology would enable, quote, men of all conditions to see themselves as others see them, end quote. In his lecture, Pictures in Progress, he proclaimed, quote, what was once the exclusive luxury of the rich and great is now within reach of all, end quote. Douglass celebrated what he saw as photography's democratizing powers, highlighting the accessibility of the medium for ordinary people. He declared, quote, the humblest servant girl may now possess a picture of herself such as the wealth of kings could not purchase 50 years ago, end quote. Leveling the social hierarchies of portraiture, photography offered a seemingly revolutionary tool of self-representation. But as Douglass heralded photography as a progressive tool, he also declared pictures to be, quote, decidedly conservative, end quote. Once captured, one's image might become, quote, a fixed fact, public property, end quote. Although clearly optimistic about the promise of photography, Douglass was also highly attuned to the importance of the struggle over representation. He knew that photographs circulated in a contested visual culture. Describing it as a mighty power, Douglass proclaimed, quote, this picture-making faculty is flung out into the world, like all others, subject to a wild scramble between contending interests and forces, end quote. He understood, as Sarah Blackwood has argued, that, quote, the visual portrait was an active site upon which the fight for African American political representation was taking place, end quote. In this contested cultural context, photography might serve as a political tool to challenge racist hierarchies, but it would not do so automatically. One would have to use the technology, as Douglass did, to perform subjectivity and claim a place in public and political spheres. Douglass was also an escape artist. As he outlines in Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, 1845, the once enslaved man emancipated himself through his learning, his fight with his purported master Covey, and his escape. And yet his self-emancipation was not sufficient while slavery persisted. In 1846, supporters in England liberated Douglass a second time by purchasing him. Douglass acquiesced to this appalling transaction so that he might continue his work of abolition without the constant threat of capture. But even this ambivalent legal emancipation would prove insufficient. Douglass understood that he also had to secure his image as a free man, and he did so through repeated photographic performances. As Ginger Hill has argued, for Douglass, the portrait, quote, becomes a way to accumulate characteristics of self-possession. It does not reflect, but makes a self, end quote. And as John Stauffer, Zoe Trott, and Celeste Marie Bernier have demonstrated, Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century. Samuel J. Miller made his portrait of Douglass sometime between 1847 and 1852 in Akron, Ohio. This is a daguerreotype of the man made close to the moment of his second emancipation through purchase. In the image, Douglas might be said to navigate the wild scramble of photographic representation, the contest between contending interests and forces. He meets the camera finely dressed and carefully coiffed. But the image does not adhere to middle-class standards. It does not mimic the space of the parlor, and the scene is devoid of studio trappings and props. Douglas sits at an angle to the camera, tightly framed and isolated in the image. The photographer has come in close to focus on his head, shoulders, and chest, accentuating his face and solemn stare. As viewer, one comes face to face with Douglas. And in his gaze, one might see a testament to the historical contents that frame his performance for the camera, the violent histories of slavery and emancipation, the private ambitions and public properties of portraiture, the promises and limitations of photography. In ending, I'd like to return to where I began, with the photographer's occupational portrait and Van der Zee's escape artist. Reading across these two images, one might come to understand not only the occupation of the photographer, but also the occupied site of the photograph. Both men stand calm in the photographer's studio, one revealing his instruments, the other displaying his shackles. Both images bring into view things that ordinarily remain unseen in photographs. One calls forth the photographer, the other calls out the myriad forces that encumber and animate photographic representation. Escape artist emblematizes the contradictory terms through which Black men enter representation in the United States. It suggests that historical shadow images and violent past pierce the present. Van der Zee's photograph of 1924 recalls the ways in which African Americans engage a repeating dynamic of constraint and fugitivity. It underscores both the liberation and the circumscription of photography. Finally, it encourages one to consider a long legacy of racial violence and representation and the ways in which African Americans have been compelled to perform as escape artists. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we are welcoming Sophie Hackett.
I'd like to also thank the organizers of the committee for the conference, for inviting me to participate today in this conference, Imagining Everyday Life Engagements with Vernacular Photography. I saw the photograph that you see here on the screen as part of an exhibition that was at the Walther collection last year, titled Mistaken Identities, Images of Gender and Transformation. It was part of a group of photographs that were very simply described as, and you can see here in square brackets, portraits from Casa Susana by an unidentified photographer circa 1970. I was intrigued by this mention of Casa Susana since in 2014, with my help, the Art Gallery of Ontario acquired a group of 340 photographs that were related to Casa Susana, which was a gathering place for M/F cross-dressers in the 1960s and 70s. And I didn't recognize this individual and nor the settings. I should say this photograph was one of 7 that was put on view, and I'll show them to you in a moment. So when invited to be part of this, I thought I should set out and find out as much as I can about this individual. This is one of the other, so to show you the group, in really fabulous matching of curtains and clothing. Again, red, clearly a favorite color, and gray or blonde wig. And then the sequence of 4 gelatin silver prints made perhaps a little later, clearly in the same locale with different outfits, but different attitudes as well, and perhaps more nighttime, something a little more comfortable. And finally, a photograph. Actually, this one was not put on view as part of the exhibition, but it was included in the group of photographs with which the that was it when the group was acquired by the Walther collection. This is one of the works that was with it, not included in the exhibition, but I think seems to be the same individual. Much like with the sort of typed up sheet that Lily showed in the morning session, there was also with the group of photographs, this group of photographs, a typed up sheet with that pretty much included an excerpt. It looks like a printout from an email or from a kind of from a computer that indicated included an excerpt of a column written by Ms. Bob Davis in 2002 for the Transgender Community News, and it identified the individual in the photograph as the crossdresser who identified herself as Bobby, and cited two different articles in Transvestia, which was a magazine founded by Virginia Prince in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And so in Transvestia, number 18 and number 22, Bobby appears. And apologies for the poor, these are sort of screen grabs from online resources, but Transvestia is actually very hard to find. So here we have the cover of Transvestia number 22 from 1963, as well as the table of contents. If you can make it out, you might enjoy the Chair chez la femme column. But also you'll note that the Susanna of Casa Susana appears in a column also called Susanna Says, that's further down. So we kind of begin to see a network forming. And so the typewritten sheet that went with the collection included a mention of the cover and that this is Bobby on the cover. And the cover, the sort of cover girl of each issue, in fact, often was accompanied with a sort of feature article about their life, so a kind of autobiographical piece, and often accompanied by photographs. So here we are again in the same issue, number 18, and up in the upper right, you may notice the same photograph. And then kind of variant or a related photograph based chiefly on the dress in the lower right. But we can see that clearly this is Bobby at home, and indeed it is Bobby. So the typescript was a very good lead indeed, and we can see that. So what else do we know? What else do we know about Bobby? In this particular, I'll come back to Transvestia 18 in a moment, but in this particular issue, Transvestia 22, the autobiographical piece gives great detail about Bobby's life and tells us, a lot about, in particular, about the ways that she's living, kind of how she goes about her kind of letting the her femme self live. So she would include kind of elaborate detail about time in hotel rooms on business trips, or which she would eventually rented a room in a rooming house where she could kind of keep her femme clothing. It kind of gives it's a very intimate, I think, and vulnerable piece. Here on the left, you can see from Transvestia 22, again, the quality is a little bit low, but identified as Bobby, and you can see a same kind of mantelpiece appear with different clothing. You'll also notice in the upper left there's Bobby as Diamond Lil, and in the prior issue you see Diamond Lil again in action, and the piece that she wrote earlier was very much about, it was called Bobby Goes Public, excuse me, which was very much about the ways that she had sorted out how to kind of be en femme in public without censure. There were, and kind of to give you a sense of, in Transvestia 18, there were 5 pages, 3 of which were dedicated to photographs, 2 of which to text. Transvestia 22, so the longer narrative about her life, 12 pages, 3 of which were dedicated to photographs. There are 12 photographs in 22 and 10 in 18, but you get the sense of, we see that this is a key part of both narratives and how they relate to each other. In the conclusion to Transvestia 18, Bobby writes, "This is one way at least to lay my heart on a silver platter for the world to see, and to do so without embarrassment or harassment. Those who don't understand accept me for my skill, costumes, and such, but with those who do understand, it has given much recognition and admiration. This has been a real reward, to be identified and admired for who I am." Interestingly, though, of course, she's playing Carmen Miranda, Annie Oakley, a Petty Maid, Diamond Lil, and so on. So it's interesting in this earlier moment, in any case, that she sort of feels more alive, certainly, or feels more at ease in her guise, in her costume. She details also very much how her wife was very much part of preparing the costumes. She details also, she alludes to, doesn't say it quite out loud, the fact that she had tried on her wife's clothing prior, and so that, and in fact, she was particularly proud of the Diamond Lil dress because it was one that her wife could not fit into any longer, and she made an alteration, and including, and she's very specific about it. We took off one strap and away it went. So it was she's clearly very proud of that particular construction. Again, further scenes from Carmen Miranda, or from Transvestia 18, rather. I should add one thing about these pictures. At the end of this article, Virginia Prince, who was the editor at the time, added a note kind of giving it an activist frame, saying, "The above brief article shows what one of us has done to solve the problem of public expression. We would like articles by others who've done the same. And by sharing these experiences with each other, someone new will be given the courage and enthusiasm to break out. Such public appearances done with dignity and in the right spirit are not only beneficial to the individual involved, but help break down public resistance to the idea of a man wearing feminine attire." So again, kind of giving it a particular framework. At the end of 22, this is the sort of concluding statement that Bobby makes. It's sort of interesting piece from its time, but I'll draw your attention to the final paragraph, which says, "A woman has so much more opportunity than a man to express her feelings and personalities in clothes." Of course, very much still in a binary mode. And then she sums up, "I can sum up by saying, as a man I exist, and as a woman I live." As I mentioned earlier, the AGO's collection that we acquired in 2014 doesn't include any photographs of Bobby. And so what is it, but what can it tell us about these pictures and provide a kind of greater context? Certainly, making and looking at photographs were central activities for the cross-dressers in the Casa Susana circle. Susanna, for instance, reports her wife Marie bemoaning the fact that she couldn't use a table destined for a food buffet, because it was so laden with cameras, flash bulbs, and photographic paper. So we can see a few. This is perhaps one of the most well-known pictures from the set. I will say that the photographs of Bobby were not made at either the Chevalier d'Eon Resort or the Casa Susana Resort, nor do they appear to be made in Susanna and Marie's New York apartment. And I thank greatly Isabelle Bonnet, who wrote her MA thesis on this collection prior to the AGO's acquisition of it, and persuasively identifies key attributes. I will not go through those, but if you want to know, I can tell you later. I will also say that photographs of cross-dressers alone or in domestic or neutral spaces are, of course, what Ms. Bob Davis relayed in a recent phone call as a hallmark of this time and for this particular cross-dressing network. So we see an unidentified figure here, for instance, here. You'll forgive the descriptive captions, which really are meant to make sure that we don't confuse one for the other, that we created in cataloging them. And then here we have Anita, who appears in several of the pictures in Susanna's collection at different moments. And I think the narrative that Bobby writes in Bobby Goes Private is really one that kind of helps flesh out the sort of sense of pleasure and interest that kind of being by yourself to be able to dress en femme kind of allowed. It also adds, so with someone like Anita, the breadth of the Casa Susana collection, we're able to see an individual in many guises, so those much more formal pictures, but then also more spontaneous ones. We have, and in fact, the picture bottom right is in fact in Susanna and Marie's apartment, and the sort of pink paint and sort of details offer one clue as to where they are. But we see clearly made by a number of different photographers in a range of different sites. I will add that the upper left picture, I would make the argument that this picture is really about the wig. And those pictures, there's a robust circulation between many of the pictures. Actually, the collection that we have at the AGO belonged to Susanna, and so there are many things addressed to Susanna or Marie, who of course owned a wig shop and was noted for kind of helping with wigs and makeup. So here we have a kind of classic, atypical kind of solicitation of fashion and makeup and hair advice. This is one part of a series of photographs we've dubbed the Dark Bob series, but you can see the typed sort of letter on the back to Marie that sort of says, "Is this better? Is that better?" So we see. Through Transvestia, of course, there was a section called Person to Person. You could write to, you could forward your letters to Transvestia that would then get forwarded on. It was not uncommon to include a photograph. You kind of had to include a photograph, really, or you wanted to include a photograph as a calling card as part of that exchange. And there was a whole system of coding for which state you were in, so that no one's identities were kind of revealed. And so we do know that the pictures did move around. So I haven't said much about the photographers, in part because this is really ongoing research. The collections are newly coming to light, I would say. And so there's a lot more to know and to learn about whether who is making the pictures. This is one of the pictures where we see someone taking the photograph, obviously with a cable release. We don't know who the man is, and we don't know the other subject in the picture, but we can kind of see the sense of play. I think I would also see, to me, it's less important as a point, in fact, with this collection, because it is, I think, is so central, the identity and the display that the identities that the individuals are trying to put forward is so important, and kind of is, so the maker in a way is subordinated, I'd say, in the discussion at this stage in any case. So I want to just make one last quick allusion to sort of this category of vernacular that we talk about, that is sort of an inelegant, I'd say, catch-all term for well, another group of photographs not destined for museum walls in many cases. The Casa Susana material, about half of it was actually on view as part of a show I did in 2016. It's actually the third exhibition that these have been part of since just around the time of their acquisition, and just most recently at the Barbican in a show called Another Kind of Life, all of which that deal with, in some ways, with the relationship of photography to queerness, gender identity, and the formation of community. We included as much as we could information. We were able to kind of, this exhibition, so this is at the AGO, and in fact you can see at the back one of the pictures that Gil posted earlier at the very end by Nan Golden. This room was coming from a room of photographs by Dan Arbus and going to a room of photographs by Nan Golden. Each set of photographs had their own space, took up their own space in their own way, and I think we attempted as much as we could to present these as they were, so not in frames, not on the wall, in a case, in a sense to kind of allude to the fact that you would pick them up, that you would trade them, that you would share them, that you would really have, kind of hold them in your hand in a way. Of course, the display doesn't allow for that, but the sense of wanting to give them a distinctive presentation and a distinctive space due to their distinctive kind of context was important. So I will say, I think this is part of a much longer program and kind of sense relationship to photography as a category in general that's at the AGO, that's been going on at the AGO since before I arrived, but continues. And I will say this is from the same exhibition. This is a presentation of photographs by Gary Winogrand. So I will say that in my mind anyway, the thinking about how to present photographs like the Casa Susana snapshots and other albums and other types of objects have, in fact, changed the way or affected the way I think about presenting work, say, by Winogrand. And here it was a sense of wanting to create something that was very, as much as possible, about movement or about a kind of moving sort of film strip-like element. In any case, I think a lot about, to wrap up very quickly, the Bobby and her statement of, as a woman I live, and I think a lot about in which spaces she could live. She lived, of course, in the spaces of the hotel rooms that she rented, in her rooming house room, at the resorts like Casa Susana, and of course in her photographs. But of course now as part of public collections like the Walther collection or the Art Gallery of Ontario, and her work is also preserved in the Louise Lawrence Transgender Archive in the Bay Area, also by Ms. Bob Davis, who acquired a group of 800 of Bobby's pictures after her death, that she lives on in these different ways, in different spaces and exhibition spaces, but also I think through networks of identification and sharing information among them. So I think there's a lot more work to do to understand about who Bobby is and who Bobby affected throughout her life, and I look forward to participating in that further discovery. Thank you.
So let me join the chorus of thanks. I feel really gratified to be here, so thanks very much to Tina and Marianne and to Brian, to Sarah for all of her work. I feel really privileged to be here with this fabulous company. I said before that I could have gone home like last night and been thrilled about the trip. Fine, great. I don't have to stay and present. I've done my thing. Okay, by being here and listening to what people have had to say. So I wanted to start us off today by showing a few of the Walther images that I've been exploring for today's presentation. Now, these are vernacular commercial images, and I'm going to add that word commercial to our keyword terms for the 2 days that we have here to think about the vernacular. These are vernacular images that are all under the category of male models. The images are part of a much larger genre of photography known as Physique photography, which was a flourishing capitalist visual culture whose heyday ranged from the post-World War II years through the late 1960s. Physique photographers such as Bob Miser, Bruce Bayless, whose work I'm showing here, also known as Bruce of LA, or Don Whitman, were part of a large international network of physique entrepreneurs who made and sold photographs, magazines, merchandise, and films by mail order to customers throughout the world. These photographs and magazines were not explicitly coded as homosexual, homophile, or gay, because to do so would render the makers and distributors liable to prosecution for obscenity, which was a serious concern for these entrepreneurs up through the late 1960s. Instead, the appeal of these vernacular photographs to same-sex desire was hidden in plain sight for discerning readers. So these magazines are central to the queer history of capitalism. At a time when gay rights organizing was just getting underway in the United States through homophile organizations such as the Mattachine Society or the Daughters of Bilitis, or Bilitis, depending on how you pronounce it, beefcake visual culture reached hundreds of thousands of readers each month, most of whom we would now call gay. There's a tendency to think that marketing to gay men and lesbians developed as a consequence of gay liberation when merchandisers discovered the gay market in the 1980s. However, the opposite is more likely the case. These mail-order businesses created a gay public where none had existed before. Magazines such as Bruce of LA's The Male Figure or Bob Miser's Physique Pictorial created a national gay market that in turn produced the conditions of possibility necessary for gay men to even conceptualize themselves as a political group, a community deserving of rights. In this argument, capitalist exchange made Stonewall possible. Now, personally, I'm persuaded by this argument, which has been advanced most recently by David Johnson. But I'd also like to suggest that there's a racial logic to this homophile public created through market relations, which moved into the streets as gay liberation unfurled post-1969. So in today's paper, I want to think through these photographs not simply through the lens of queer capitalism, but instead through the lens of queer racial capitalism. And by racial capitalism, I'm referring to the vein of scholarship inspired by Cedric Robinson's work on the Black radical tradition that has argued that the longer histories of slavery and unfree labor cannot be separated from the history of capitalist exchange, commodification, and accumulation. In other words, capitalism and racial capitalism are synonymous. So today I'll gesture to just a few places where I think we can see how physique photographs carry the signifiers of a longer history that ties together visuality, desire, racial formation, and the market. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the photographer Bob Miser, whose work in the Walther collection is represented by some rather jovial shower shots, which we have here. Hence, it's Raining Men, of course, I had to say that. So a lot of these photographs were taken after the models had performed in one of Miser's short films, also known as Danglies, for those of you who are interested in your history of porn. Anyway, so Miser had, I don't need to explain why, I suppose, why that's the case. So Miser had moved from Idaho to LA in 1927 when he was a kid. He had an older brother who was 15 years older than him, and with his mom, Delia, who's a widower. She bought a 9-bedroom funeral home in Los Angeles and took in lodgers while gay teenage Miser began taking photographs of the hunky bodybuilders on Venice's Muscle Beach while developing these photographs in a weird, closet in the ceiling attic space of this funeral home. So what eventually became Miser's physique photography empire began as a modeling agency called the Athletic Model Guild, or AMG, which Miser set up in the garage. Now, post-World War II was raining young men unmoored from their homes in places like Oklahoma and Idaho. Some were recently discharged from the service, others were hustlers and street kids, others were Hollywood-bound and needed photographs for their Go See books, where Miser made photographs such as these. The operation was a family affair, with his brother doing the bookkeeping and his mom knitting the posing straps. Miser soon realized that his business interests lay not in the modeling agency, but in the photographs themselves, which he sold to readers through the mail. And he began his own magazine in 1951, Physique Pictorial on the left. By the mid-50s, there were over a dozen of these magazines in circulation with titles such as The Male Figure, which was Bruce Avelet's magazine, Young Adonis, Grecian Guild Pictorial, etc. But Miser's empire, as well as that of H. Lynn Womack's DC-based Guild Press, dominated the field. Then, after Miser died, and his mother died in 1964, he bought 4 contiguous lots adjacent to the property and created a 3/4-acre studio complex of multiple buildings, an Olympic-sized pool with locked gates, a buzzer system, and watchdogs, mostly to keep out some of the more criminally inclined models. So these magazines participated in what Maria Waike has called the classical alibi, a rhetoric of classicism that, by referencing the sculpture of ancient Greece and Rome, allowed physique photographers to provide a rationalization for the pleasurable contemplation of the male body while avoiding obscenity charges, not always successfully, I might add. And in the classic references of the physique magazines, we see another instance of the vernacular, working with last night's discussion of the Greek etymology of the word verna as slave. These classical references also allowed the physique magazines to eroticize power exchange through BDSM connotations of the Greek slave market. In the contemporaneous context of the civil rights movement, this fantasy scene's shadow archive is, of course, also racial capitalism's history of Black and indigenous slavery in the Americas. So the AMG shower photographs appeared for the first time in the February 1963 issue of Physique Pictorial. And Miser explained a few months later that, quote, "Ever since one of our readers sent us a shot of a young man taking a shower aboard a Navy vessel, we have been shooting shower photos ourselves, hoping we could get some of the natural candid quality of the other photographer achieved." This Walther photograph of John Lenhart was published in the February 1963 issue. And this is from the prior page. It's a close-up. This issue is also the first time that Miser printed these mysterious codes with each model's photograph. And you can see Lenhart's on the bottom left-hand corner of the image. According to Miser, these astrologically inflected squiggles, quote, provided a qualitative and quantitative psychological analysis of the model's character. Readers could purchase a subjective character analysis chart to decode them. So in John's case, for example, we could learn that he has an agreeable personality, but he also liked to dominate. And he also had, but Miser also had like an unpublished subjective character analysis chart, which he didn't distribute to the public, which included both sexual proclivities such as will suck or can be sucked, in addition to less charitable assessments such as model over the hill or on dope. Now, taking a look at this second character analysis chart, and that's the one on the right in Bob Miser's handwriting, we can learn a little bit more about John Lenhart, or at least Miser's assessment of him. The double cross in the middle, for example, suggests that John is sick, fanatic, crazy, religious. He is also, according to the attenuated S on the far right, stupid. And perhaps for this reason, this is the only photograph of John I was able to find in Physique Pictorial. Now, these codes landed Miser in hot water because although he had been successful in avoiding obscenity charges since 1954, the LAPD Vice Squad arrested Miser for basically running a prostitution ring, and he was convicted and served time in 1968. Now, character analysis, which is what Miser claimed to be offering his readers, has a history that is really quite directly tied to racial capitalism. And the years after World War I, character analysis had been a prominent visual technology that employment managers used to slot workers into positions best suited for their presumed character type. Like Miser, character analysts observed their subjects, surreptitiously jotting down a shorthand code that denoted personality and character traits. The preeminent practitioner was Dr. Catherine Blackford, a medical doctor who took a world tour before World War I in order to study the world's racial types. In the teens and 20s, she became a well-known employment consultant. In books such as The Science of Character Analysis and Reading Character at Sight, she brought scientific racism, efficiency discourse, and popular psychology into the personnel office and onto the pages of popular magazines and into correspondence schools. Blackford's popular system of character analysis was a technology of racial capitalism, offering scientific legitimacy to white supremacist ideology in the workplace. Now, Bob Miser's character analysis chart can be read as a parody, one could say, of Blackford's techniques. His chart, after all, is labeled a subjective character analysis, and we can be reasonably sure that Blackford's trained observers were not interested in trying to decipher whether or not job applicants were, quote, a good fuck. In Miser's case, however, this skill was in fact part of what the employees brought to the job. Other aspects of Miser's character analysis clearly relate to the work ethic and other capitalist concerns, such as devotion to duty and work or good money maker. Miser may not have been familiar with Blackford's work, but the entire method of character analysis is inseparable from this longer history of racial science and white supremacy. So another trace of physique photography's imbrication with racial capitalism concerns the longer history of the genre, of physique photography as a genre. The few scholars who have considered this question usually place this history with the early 20th century public fascination with bodybuilders and muscular display, especially with Eugene Sandow, and then later, slightly later, Bernard McFadden, both of whom had commercial empires that included physique magazines. Sandow, in particular, modeled his ideal proportions on classical sculpture, promoting what he called the Grecian ideal as an ideal physique. Personally, though, I have to say that I think we can predate this history a bit more because, as I've argued elsewhere, in an essay that Patricia Hayes very sweetly edited a long time ago, Edward Muybridge's massive human and animal locomotion project at the University of Pennsylvania, which resulted in over 100,000 images of moving men, women, children, animals, and birds, this was a project that was, in fact, shaped by contemporaneous theories of evolutionary race science. Several of the scientists who sponsored Muybridge at Penn also founded the American Anthropometric Society. The mixed-race boxer Ben Bailey, who we see here, was the only non-white model of the 95 that Muybridge worked with. And with Bailey, we see the introduction of physical anthropology's anthropometric grid for the first time in American photography. And this grid remained, oddly enough, in Miser's physique photography, perhaps a tenuous reference to scientific investigation, surely a weak alibi in these particular photographs. Now, Shawn has written beautifully about the Muybridge project most recently, but today what I'd like to focus on is not what she has explored as the optical unconscious of movement, but instead on Bailey's musculature. Because University of Pennsylvania was at this very precise moment introducing mechanical fitness machines to their athletic program in order to create a more robust musculature among their elite white students. In a period characterized by white anxieties over neurasthenia and over civilization, this white muscle building project was designed as an antidote to the sunken-chested physiques of even the most accomplished athletes, such as champion athlete Thomas Greer, who we see here, who was also a Penn student and an assistant on this Muybridge project. And he had just recently won the mile walk, which is one of the reasons why he was selected to demonstrate his champion motions. Now, Bailey already had this muscular body. He was a boxer. He probably did manual labor as well. And in the classic instance of racialized love and theft, his physique became a model for white middle-class men, even while he and other non-white models disappeared from the pages of strength and fitness magazines and manuals. Press coverage of Muybridge's work compared the athlete's musculature to Greek and Roman art and architecture, the beginnings of physique photography's Greek alibi. But the racism is here as well. One reporter refers to Ben Bailey as, quote, a monstrous mulatto with the head of a gorilla and the body of a Hercules. Thus, the racial project of physique photography, how to get the body of a Hercules with a white head. This was the question that an entire industry of health, strength, bodybuilding, and physique magazines, let alone the athletic departments of Ivy League schools, was designed to answer. The connections to physique photography's pornographic valences are here as well. As Linda Williams argued 30 years ago, it's hard to believe, the roots of pornographic film's frenzy of the visible can also be found in Muybridge's project. Now, Williams drew on Freud's theory of the fetish, wherein the male viewer masters the threat of castration, as well as on Mulvey's theory of the, shall we say, heteronormative gaze. But what if we turn our attention to Muybridge's male models through the lens of porn studies and work with another theory of the fetish, one drawn from Marx rather than from Freud? Because Ben Bailey, who was a Philadelphia boxer, was identified as a mulatto in Muybridge's notebooks and in the census, and the slave trade, of course, was outlawed in the U.S. in 1820, which means that nearly 1 million new slaves born between 1820 and 1865 were born solely of black slave women's reproductive labor. Ben Bailey's light skin, his mulatto designation, signifies the violence of slavery, of racial capitalism. As Walter Johnson writes of slavery in this period, the, quote, forcible joining of family histories in which the fortunes of the white line depended on the furtherance of the black was an economy in which human semen and ovum were turned into capital. Ben Bailey's light-skinned body carries with it the history of slavery's commodity fetishism, the process through which the social relations of labor become the secret of commodity things. Now, as we learned long ago from Cobina Mercer, as well as more recently by scholars such as Morel Miller-Young, the visual representation of black sexuality is complex. It's a site of collective trauma for black viewers, while at the same time a place that can offer the possibility for a queer politics of dissent with prevailing norms, such as the dichotomies of positive versus negative images of respectability. So my intention here is not so much to challenge these readings, which I admire, but instead to bring more clearly into view physique photography's shadow archive. And as I've tried to suggest today, this is an archive not only of capitalism, of relations of exchange, accumulation, and profit, but also of race. Black and indigenous genocide and slavery made U.S. capitalism possible, and this history, the history of racial capitalism, shadows all commercial archives, including this one. Thank you.
Stop. Good afternoon. Hi. First of all, thank you. Again, thank you. It's always such a treat to be with such an incredible group of thinkers and scholars. Tina, Marianne, Brian, Arthur, Sarah, Remy, thank you so much for having me here, having all of us. So for the last about 2 years, I've been leading a small team of photographers, scholars, and students working with former Black Panther Kathleen Neal Cleaver to identify, organize, catalog, and digitize her personal photography collection. And she has, coming under the name of what she's calling the Eldridge and Kathleen Cleaver Family Archive. Within that collection, I'm writing about a family photo album. Oh, let's see. Okay, there we go. A family photo album that Cleaver compiled, chronicling the years that she and her husband, writer and Black Panther Minister of Information, Eldridge Cleaver, and their 2 children, Maceo and Joju, lived in Algeria and France as exiles from the United States in the years 1969 and 1973. I'm not sure, there we go. So in thinking about the Walther collection, I was drawn to the Miss Black America album. There we go. Not only because of its form and its, oh, sorry, I'll go back. Its form, this is trickier than it looks, y'all. Okay. Not only because of its form and its focus on Black subjects, but I was interested in the contemporaneity of the 2 albums. Cleaver's album from 1969 to 73, and the Miss Black America album from 1971. So in February 1971, Private Paul Lavalace, I'm not sure how we say his name, there we go, of the 23rd Division Medical Battalion stationed in Chu Lai, Vietnam, made photographs of the USO tour of Miss Black America. And as he writes in the front pages of the album, it was a moment when the USO proudly presented the Miss Black America show, and nearly 5,000 GIs showed up. About 90% were Black. I actually don't know how to pronounce his name, if anyone has any thoughts on it. Lavalace. In French, yes, okay. No, I'm just curious. I think probably from the south it may or may not, but we'll go. New Orleans, it's Lavalace. Okay, we're gonna go with Lavalace then. If Deb says it's Lavalace, then we're going with Lavalace. And Lavalace felt moved to compile these images into an album. He wrote, "I can show you the pictures, but I could never fully express the feelings of the Black GIs of the American Division on that particular day in February of 1971. It's a day to long remember for all the GIs, Black and white, who witnessed the Miss Black America show, another part of Black American history being made. Never before have there been a show like it in the NAM and nowhere else." In February 1971, let's see, go back. In February 1971, the Cleavers had been living in Algiers for more than a year and a half. Both their children were born during their time in exile from the US. They shared their homes with a growing number of Black Panthers and hijackers living in forced or voluntary exile. Kathleen, with Eldridge's assistance, had established the International Office of the Black Panther Party, eventually recognized by the Algerian government as an official liberation movement, and in doing so provided the party with an embassy, telephones, and telex, and a monthly stipend. At the end of February 1971, the Cleavers were expelled from the party they'd helped build, and those who remained with the Cleavers reorganized into the Revolutionary People's Communication Network. So I'm interested in how the photo album became a repository or narrative device for 2 distinct, if not opposing, realities of African Americans abroad in the era of Black power and global third world struggles. One album featuring Black Americans who fight and kill for US imperial expansion, the other featuring Black Americans actively building solidarity with building solidarity with and are themselves declared enemies of the U.S. state. Yet each trying to survive the encounter with American power, and each living blackness abroad under conditions of uncertainty and hostility. What work does the photo album do in narrating Black lives abroad in this moment? So in my research around the Cleaver Algiers album, I think sort of situated, okay, we'll come back to that. See the album as doing three kinds of visual work. Homemaking, memorializing, and curating. First, we can consider Cleaver's photographs at the moment of their creation as a project of homemaking. As the family lived in exile and birthed and raised their children while also serving as U.S. ambassadors for the global Black liberation movement, photographs and photography demonstrated Cleaver's efforts, of making a way, of creating and holding a space where her children and community could thrive. Second, in the assemblage of the album, we can see the work of memorializing, a commitment to documentation, a registering of loss, an act of celebrating a time and place of her life that was gone when she assembled it in the 1980s, a marriage ending, a laying to rest. Memorialization, beyond commemoration or celebration, we can think about the album as a kind of narrative form that wittingly or not allows for incompleteness, that holds space for the unspoken and unsayable, and concedes to the simultaneity of joy and trauma rather than one or the other. I think the family album functions as both, or the photo album functions here as both elegy and eulogy, and offers Cleaver another way of telling history. In contrast to the scholarly essays Cleaver has written of this period of her life, including what was her senior honors thesis at Yale University, the album, those function as affective history. The album offers an affective history, one that must reckon with complexities, and as a form is too messy, too obstreperous to withhold, externalize, or deny entirely the failures and disappointments of the relations contained therein. It's a form which cannot deny negative affect or bad attachments, like boredom, exhaustion, laziness, or betrayal. In doing so, it holds out the possibility of acknowledging the personal and political failures of the Cleaver's time in exile, failure without the political impulse of redemption that, in the words of diaspora scholar Ziana Owen, are so central to the Black left's revisionist narratives of resistance. If the senior thesis and her essays, Cleaver's essays teach us, but the album, as Owen might say, refuses to counsel us. Finally, we might understand Kathleen Cleaver's act of compiling the album as one of curating. And I use the word in both its originary meaning of caretaking and also in its sort of current usage as tasteful selection. Thus, I would like to offer, I think we can think of Cleaver's collecting and assemblage as creative acts of radical caretaking. All of this work, homemaking, memorializing, curating, is continuous, ongoing, and evident in each moment, signaled here by my use of the gerund. Following Tina Campt, I ask, what is the tense of this album? We might say that the Algiers album operates in three tenses, right? The past, present, and future in its simplest manifestations and original forms. When the Cleavers lived in exile, and later when Kathleen assembled the album, Kathleen organizes the collection currently. What will happen to the collection and how will it be used? However, Campt, in the context of the Black diasporic photographic collection she considers, identifies the tense of Black feminist futurity as that which will, quote, have had to happen, attachment to a belief in what should be true, living the future now, end quote. These images she offers hum with a tension between freedom and abjection. Black feminist futurity operates in the continuous. I am living, I am breathing, I am actively creating conditions of freedom. So what I want to do is offer some brief impressions of the Miss Black USA album that Paul Lavallee put together. It is an album, I think, that on one hand is fascinating for its depiction of Black GI life, for its imaging of the expression of Black power politics. Oops, where am I going? Okay. There we go, that's what for its depiction of Black GI life, for its imaging of the expression of Black power politics amongst Black soldiers at the apex or the nadir of the Vietnam War. A war in which Black soldiers were disproportionately drafted, disproportionately assigned the most menial and most dangerous jobs, underrepresented in the officer corps, and overrepresented in court-martials and military prisons, and injured and killed at disproportionately higher rates than their white counterparts. The USO-sponsored tour of Miss Black America and her entourage was a stroke of marketing inspiration for the flagging morale of Black soldiers in particular. Stephanie Clark of Washington, D.C. was only the third to wear the Miss Black America crown. It was a pageant that was started by Philadelphia businessman J. Morris Anderson as a protest against the exclusion of Black women from the Miss America pageant, from the all-white Miss America pageant. In its own stroke of marketing inspiration, the original pageant aired on television in September 1968, immediately following and amidst feminist protests against the all-white Miss America pageant. And so even the invocation of Black power in something as profoundly sexist and retrogressive as the Miss America beauty pageant could dress a thing up as radical. Stephanie Clark, along with her runners-up, sporting afros, bearing brown skin, asserting and performing Black is beautiful, could offer the GIs a taste of home and pride. As a May 1967 Time magazine article on the Negro soldier in Vietnam described, that many Negro soldiers prefer to pull their passes in Saigon's self-segregated Soulsville. The girls of a warren of bars and brothels along Canoy Street near the capital's waterfront. The girls of Soulsville, many of them dark-skinned Cambodians or the daughters of French Senegalese soldiers, are less costly and usually less comely than their sisters on white-dominated Tudeau Street nearby. White soldiers' looks in those Tudeau bars, growls one Negro private. Man, they hurt more than a claymore, end quote. So the page on which two Black GIs hold a Black Power banner and each other while Black GIs around them hold their fists up in a Black Power salute, then offers a crescendo in the already cacophonous sequence of the album. Their fists pushing toward the sky remind me of the iconic photograph of Black Panther women made by Perkle Jones and Ruth Marion Baruch. On stage, Miss Black America holds her fists up, there we go, in call and response and mutual recognition. For one fugitive moment, the GIs are out of formation from the U.S. military. But for a dreamlike instance, this collection of Black Americans so far from home are in harmony with each other, and so too we imagine with global Black liberation struggles. Yet, it is for all these same reasons that I find the Miss Black USA album deeply disturbing. The way Lavallee's camera frames the GIs looking at the women who nearly recede into the photograph's vanishing point, interpolating subsequent album viewers into a textbook iteration of the male gaze. The photographs of waiting GIs, the looks of boredom or exhaustion or weariness in their faces. The repetition of the title or the honorific or the epithet of queen, the queen, our queen, that at once elevates and dismisses its bearer and also suggests a fulfillment of what African-American women's historian Eula Taylor has called the promises of patriarchy. Again, the Time magazine article, which is just truly horrible, says, quote, often inchoate and inconsistent, instinctively self-serving yet naturally altruistic, the Negro fighting man is both savage in combat and gentle in his regard for the Vietnamese. He may fight to prove his manhood, perhaps as a corrective to the matriarchal dominance of the Negro ghetto back home, end quote. Yes, Jesus. The page of the Black Power salute crescendos into the convergence of conscripted Black labor in a war of imperialist expansion that finds momentary relief in the spectacle of Black women's performing bodies, with a Black Power banner somehow endorsing this exchange, and the American flag nowhere but of course everywhere sanctioning this scene of subjection, these innocent amusements in Saidiya Hartman's phrase, this tender violence in Laura Wexler's phrase, that smoothly interpolate us into positions of reaffirming imperial rights, as Ariella alerted us yesterday. But there is an after of this crescendo, fugitive, because here Lavallee's narration notes that the crowd fights the military police to get closer to take pictures. One GI manages to get through, but is caught before he reaches the stage. Lavallee's images show us a police action to discipline black soldiers and MPs standing between the performers and a now seated audience whose energy and enthusiasm had to be contained. Here, the final page of their fist raised toward the sky in the enclosure, of the U.S. military base reminds me of John Shearer's photographs of the Attica prison uprising, also 1971. Black power and solidarity against the conscription of imperial power. To return to the question of what work the album does in narrating Black lives abroad, I've been thinking in our conversation over the last day that whether we name it vernacular or quotidian or everyday or something else, I think we are witnessing again how photography functions equally as a tool of domination and as a practice of survival. How we as individuals attempt to make sense of our lives and narrate our own histories in the most extraordinary and also brutally ordinary of conditions. Thank you.